What's up, you jagoffs? It's been a busy week or two. But I still came up with some footage to slap together a video for you guys. Today, I'm going to be walking you through how I dual purpose my hobbies when I get a chance to get out of the house. So last weekend, my brother-in-law, my cousin-in-law, and I went out to the infamous Piney Creek to do some fishing. Just kidding, it's not really infamous. Really, at its widest part, it's probably, I don't know, 29.4 feet across. Not huge, tiny. Piney Creek, they should call it Tiny Creek. But nonetheless, we got out to throw a line in the water and to practice our snagging abilities. And man, did we do good at that. I took my camera along and I snagged a few decent photos while we were fishing Piney Creek in the Frankstown branch. Enjoy. So looking at all the photos I took about 150. I only brought 130 of them into my computer. I already copied and pasted them from the SD card. So what I have to do now is I have to choose the ones that I want to edit in Lightroom, and then I can move forward with that. Once we have all those files picked out, I'll throw them into a folder so we don't lose those buggers. So I'm going to start to go through here and select some of the files that I want. But I did want to show you an easier way that you can do this. If I just go into Lightroom itself, because that's where we're going to be making our edits, I can actually, now you can see I already have a Piney Creek album that I started to edit some photos, but I'm going to make a new one just to show you guys some of the stuff you can do with Lightroom. I'm going to create a new folder, so I open up Lightroom here. I'm actually going to create a new album, and I'm just going to call this Piney Creek Edits. Alright, this image looks like junk because it's meant to look vintage, but I'll show you how we do that later on. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to click on a photo that's not edited so far. So you can see I already edited this one. This is my brother-in-law Chad, and then my cousin-in-law in the background walking up the hill. But I'm just going to start with some of these photos here and show you guys how we edit. So the first thing I need to start with is the main settings here. Okay, so if I look at this, the buttons over here on the far right, these are where all of my edits are going to take place. So I'm going to click this first one, and that's going to edit all of the properties of the photo itself. I go into the main edit window here, parameters. Also, if you don't see this scrolled out, if you right click and change it from compact to normal, that gives you a little bit more room to edit. Also, if you click on each parameter here, so we've got light, color, effects, detail, optics, and geometry. If you click on that, it'll expand it, and then you can edit the settings. I set my Lightroom up so I can only do one at a time, so I have to click on color to get into color, I have to click on light to get into light. That's just how I prefer it. I think the default is that it just shows you everything. So yeah, so let's start off with our first edits. So I'm going to change the exposure here, and just the overarching rule for all of the parameters that you can edit is less is more. I tell that to my students in the classes that I teach. You don't want to crank up the exposure or crank down the exposure and all these other settings, because then everything will just look fake. So we started off with the exposure, and we're going to bring that up a little bit. Okay, not too much. Remember, less is more. We're going to up the contrast, and you'll see how much depth we can get on this image. If we brought it down, then it would just flatten the image. Sometimes I like to kind of swing it both ways and see what those edits do to the photo. But I'll bring it up maybe around 50 or so. I can change the highlights. So if I want more highlights or less highlights, we'll up that just a little bit, maybe around 20 or so. And then we'll bring the shadows down, but not too far. So we'll bring the shadows down a little bit. Same thing with the whites. We'll bring that up, bring the blacks down a little bit. Okay, now the curves here, this point curve. What we can do is we can either set the main curve of the image, which will work on the brightness and contrast, or we can do each individual color in terms of RGB, red, green, blue. So I'm going to click down here. What I usually like to do is I like to use a shallow S-curve depending on the image. And by the way, as you make your edits, you want to look at this right here. This is called the histogram. So the histogram will show us whether we're, way underexposed, like so, whether we're way overexposed, or if it's more balanced. So you want it to be more balanced than, overexposed or underexposed. Same thing if we change the contrast, if we really up the contrast, it'll flatten that, the histogram. And also on the histogram, there's a main curve, and then you can see there's a red, green, and blue graph that kind of runs through the middle of it. So just a heads up there, that's one thing that we can do to ensure that at least technically our image is balanced. Now, it really depends on what kind of look you're going for as well. So if you're not going for a balanced look and you want something that's kind of out of the ordinary, then this won't really serve your needs. But anyway, let's get back to the point curve. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to start at the bottom quadrant here and just drag that down just ever so slightly, and then I'm going to come up here, add a node, and then drag that up above that line. Okay, so it's a very shallow S. But you can see if I drag that way down, it actually looks kind of nice, adding some more contrast. And obviously if I make the brights way too bright, then it kind of takes away from it. So actually, I'm not going to use an S-curve on this one because it would be way overexposed. I'm just going to use kind of a belly downwards. And then I'm going to go into the reds and bring those down. No, you know what? I'm going to bring those up. And then go into the greens, bring those up, and then go into the blues. Maybe bring those down just a tad. So it has kind of a reddish yellow tint or hue to it. Now I can go into color. Now obviously we already messed with the color a little bit with the point curves, but we can further edit it in the color panel. So in the color mixer here, let's start off with the temperature. We could use a preset white balance. We could auto white balance it. I never really like that. It always seems to, at least with winter photos, it seems to turn it yellowy. You could do as shot for the white balance, but we're going to make it custom. So let's go ahead and experiment here. So I'm going to make it a little bit blue. Obviously if I go too far, then just looks like junk, but I don't want to bring it too far. I'll just bring it down a tad, maybe add some magenta there, or purple, whatever that might be. Maybe up the vibrance just a tad. That's way too much purple, so I'll bring that down, maybe add some green instead. Nope, we'll just +3 that on the purple. We'll up the vibrance a little bit. Now again, you don't want to go too far because then it's just like, oh, well, that's not a real image. So we'll go +19. Saturation, we'll bring that up just a tad as well. Then we can go into the color mixer. And right now we're editing the hue. You can edit the color, you can edit the hue, you can edit the saturation, and you can edit the luminance. I don't usually do all of those. I usually just stick to the luminance. So now our water's a lot more blue than it was, but we don't want to overdo it. So let's see here. I want to change the yellows and the oranges just a little bit. Now it's very difficult to see the changes with the luminance, but it depends what colors are in the scene itself. But this one you can see the blues and purples are the main squeeze, if you will, for this picture. All right, so let's go into effects. Now obviously we could go further with color, but I don't think we need to at this point. So we could adjust the midtone, shadows, and highlights, and you can play around with that as you see fit. But I'm not going to do that. So let me bring that back to the middle. Bring that to the middle, and close that up. So let's go into the effects. Now the effects, this is further customization you can add. So if I wanted texture, I could add texture. It makes it a little bit too sharp to be believable. And then if you lower the texture too much, then everything's blurry and it looks like a watercolor painting. So I'm just gonna click here and type 0. Leave the texture alone for that one. But then I'll go down to clarity. I usually edit the clarity, the dehaze, and then the vignette. So I'm gonna add some clarity. Actually, let's see here. Yeah, I'll add a little bit of clarity, and then a little bit of dehazing, and then the vignette basically just creates like a soft border around the edge. So if you go upwards, it's white, and if you go downwards, it's black. Most of the time I use black, especially if it's for landscape photography. The white just looks a little bit cheesy to me, especially if you crank it up the whole way. But if you were doing some type of portrait or old school style photograph that you wanted that kind of cheesy old looking vignette, then you could use that. The black one it makes you focus more on the middle of the image rather than the edges. So if I turn it off, you can see sometimes your eyes go to different spots in the image rather than towards the middle. So maybe I'll just add a little touch of that, and then I can go forward into detail. The grain, I don't usually add any grain to my images. Kind of defeats the purpose of having a nice camera. But then we can sharpen it if we want to. Again, you don't want to overdo it, so I'll add a little bit, and then you can reduce the noise. Now if you reduce the noise too much, it'll kind of soften it a lot and won't look so good. And then optics I don't usually mess with, because I don't usually take a lot of like wide angle shots or fisheye lens shots, but you can use the lens correction, and then you can change the profile to, let's say, a Canon. We'll use the 10-22. On this one I was actually using a 75-300. So here's a 70-300. Okay, which it helps get rid of some of the warp, but I don't usually use that. So we'll leave it for now. We could change the distortion if we wanted to. You can see mostly on the edges here. Is where the changes are going to occur. So it kind of unwrinkles it. And then you can add or subtract lens vignetting. Again, I don't usually mess with that. So you can also defringe it, and defringing basically, if you have a lot of saturation in the image, this one not so much because there's not that much saturation and I didn't add much. But what you can do is you can actually choose either the purples or the greens, and then you can actually, what this does is it basically gets rid of any excess, like any bleed over from like colors. So if these weeds right here were bleeding out onto the branches before them, okay, or in front of them, then it would actually get rid of that. But we're not having much of an issue with that right now because of how we edited it, so I'm not going to defringe it at all. But then the geometry. So the geometry is just where you can further correct like your lens bulge or anything like that. Same thing with the vertical distortion. I don't usually mess with the geometry of the image. You can change the aspect of it, but you can also do that in the next step. So let's go on to the crop and straighten. We can actually change the aspect ratio. So this is mainly for if you're looking to get something printed out. You can choose a 4:5 standard picture, 5:7, 16:9 if you want it to be like widescreen. But I usually leave all of mine as original as I can. Sometimes I do crop it or I do straighten it, and if you do straighten an image, it will crop so that it's not just like full of nothingness. So it does tend to, reduce what is visible in that image. For this one, I don't really have to straighten it that much, so I'm gonna hit this return arrow because the horizon is pretty level. I on my camera I have the rule of thirds grid lines on constantly, so I'm constantly looking for how I'm taking my shots. But once in a while I will adjust this a little bit. You can also flip your images, so if you do have one that was taken vertically that you need to flip, you can use that. You can also flip it horizontally. This one might be a good candidate to do that if I was looking for the user's eye to actually go left to right. Okay, I kind of have a leading line with this bank here, but I could also just use it like this, so it goes forward. It goes from the front of the image towards the back of the image. You can flip it vertically as well. Obviously it doesn't make sense in this case. Moving forward, we have the healing brush. The healing brush is really neat because if you have anything like a power line, or if you have some acne that you want to get rid of, or you name it, you can actually just use the healing brush, and it works just like the healing brush in Photoshop or the clone stamp tool us old folks are used to using. But if I zoom in here, let's say I want to get rid of this branch, for example, what I can do is I'm just going to two-finger scroll to change my brush size to make it a little bit smaller, just barely larger than that branch. And what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to start to paint, and I'm just going to paint a small section, and then what will happen is it gives me two nodes. So it gives me the node that I painted, and then it gives me a node that I'm actually going to be cloning. So if I move this over here, okay, and usually because this is snow, you can't see the reference lines. You kind of can, but let me do it up here, and I'll show you what I mean. So I'll just paint a little bit, and then I'll zoom out. Now it's sampling from further away in the image. Lightroom has a smart system that supposedly copies from an area that allows you to hide things better. It doesn't always work the greatest, so it really, you're gonna have to tinker with this a little bit to get the results that you want. For example, here's a tree. It actually did match up with a tree in the background, which is really awesome. But yeah, so slowly getting rid of that tree. And another thing that I always tell my students is the more zoomed in you are, especially while you're doing something like cloning or healing, using the healing brush, the more zoomed in you are, the better off the image will look when you're zoomed back out. So now let's just zoom out. I'm going to get rid of this, but because I don't want to hide that tree. But I could hide that tree and be very hard to tell, especially because we're so far away. So there we go. So now you can't even tell. Now obviously you can see that the rest of the branch or rest of the tree here, but you really can't tell. I don't need to do that on this image, so I'm not going to. And then you can obviously change the feathering of your brush as well. So let's move forward to the brush. So the brush is really neat because it's not exactly the healing brush, but what you can do with it is you can paint an area, and then you can make specific edits to that area. And by the way, if you guys see there's a circle on the inside, and then there's a circle on the outside. The circle on the inside is where the actual brush is going, and then the circle on the outside is the feathering. So it is feathering out, so it's not a very hard brush. It's kind of a softer brush. But I just painted over most of the water, and I can see that by hovering over this the first node here. You can see it selected most of the water. I missed a little bit here because I was just kind of doing it quickly. I'm not actually going to be using this edit on this photo, but just to show you what it does. So there we go. So I painted most of the water here, missed a little bit there, missed a little bit there, and let's see, there we go. So now what I can do is I can actually come down through, and I can change the color in all the same parameters we did in the main one. But I can change it just where I painted. So if I want to make this water look super blue, I can bring the blues up a little bit, maybe bring the purples up a little bit, and just so on and so forth. So maybe bring the exposure down, a little more contrast. So there we go. So this is starting to look a little bit fake, so I'm going to bring that back down a little bit. Same thing with the contrast, so I don't want it to look fake. But yeah, so that's the brush tool, and it's pretty much the same edits here, except you are given the moire. Okay, the moire is an Italian term that basically means silk. The moire is mainly used for whenever you have textures. So if you have like a silky texture in an image, or if you have multiple textures that are kind of running into one another, you can use the moire. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but I like the way that sounds. I'm Italian, so hey, why not? Forget about it. So moire, and then we've got another defringe, or defringe. What? So we have another defringe for the colors, like the color bleeding, and you can change the sharpness and all that good stuff. Let's move on to the linear gradient and the radial gradient. These both do the same thing, and it's very similar to the brush tool, but we're going to move into that next. Now, the linear gradient and the radial gradient work best. Well, first, let's say this. Linear gradient works best with landscapes, and the radial gradient, I can't say that in this voice, but the radial gradient works best with portraits. So let's go ahead and get into the linear gradient, and I'm just gonna bring it over from the water over, and all I'm gonna do is just click and drag like so, and I can move it if I want. Alright, and I can move it here, and I can also rotate it. Ooh, I added a second one, so let me Control Z that. Click on this one, and I want to go like so. There we go. So basically what this is going to be doing is, if I click it one time, it'll show me what that gradient is doing. Okay, so the area in red is going to be edited just like the brush was, the area in red was edited. So I can do the same thing. I can bring the temperature down. So if I wanted it to actually fade from like a super blue, maybe I'll bring the shadows down on this one and the blacks down a little bit. So it's fading from like a dark blue into a lighter blue, and yeah, so it's basically the same thing as a brush tool, except for it's a gradient and you can move it around, and all that jazz. Alright, that might be a little bit much. That's fine. And then I'll go into the radial gradient just to show you what it can do. And I'm just gonna draw it somewhere like around a tree over here, like so. Same thing here. You can rotate it, you can move it, you can change the size, and then again the same thing. You can change the temperature. Right now I have it inverted, but if I don't want it to be inverted and I just want it to edit that specific area of the picture, then I can do so. Or if you want it inverted, I did that on one of the images, and again you can change all the settings and stuff with that radial gradient. I don't want that, so I'm gonna get rid of it, and there we go. So that's my edited photo. Now that I have my image finished, what I can do is I can hit this little share button up here, click that, and then I usually just export a large JPEG. That way I can always resize it later. You could export the original. That's really up to your preference or what you're going to be using it for. If you need it to be, web ready, then maybe upload export a small JPEG. And then I'm going to put this into my edits folder, and I'm going to name these later, but alright. So I'm going to go through and edit all these photos and show you the end results. That's it for this video. That's it. 20-something minutes long. My goodness. Hope you guys liked the video. I hope you learned something along the way. The next video won't be quite as long. I do promise you that. Make sure you hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and make sure you hit the bell so you're notified whenever I come out with new content. All right, Avvampato out.